All right, board members, colleagues, members of the public, welcome to our new chambers for the SACOG Board of Directors. The sound seems to be pretty good. We'll see well, I'm sure there are going to be adjustments as we go forward. I'm told the paint on the walls is dry, but just in this room. A little other work going on still in the office suite here. But welcome. We've actually got a very special meeting today for a couple of reasons. One is we're here in our new chambers, but more importantly, we've got our Civic Lab Year 2 folks with us today. And before our official SACOG meeting begins, we are going to do a SACOG Year 2 Civic Lab graduation. So we're going to have a video in a couple minutes here. I think we're going to hear from a few folks, including James. After today's meeting, just so you can plan ahead, after today's meeting, there is a lunch in this room. So not only did we give you breakfast in the small room behind me, but we're giving you lunch here afterwards. And at that lunch, there will be presentations from many of the Civic Lab teams. So I encourage all of you, board members, members of the public, stick around for the lunch. It is an actual free lunch. There's no tie-in, and there's a bonus if you get to hear about what Civic Lab Year 2 has been working on with regard to transforming our commercial corridors. So this morning, James, I think we're going to go right to a video, if I have the order of things right. But I think it's important today that we recognize the hard work that so many of our teams have been involved with in Civic Lab. And so we're going to celebrate that a little bit here in a few minutes. So if you want to run the video,
today we celebrate. We celebrate the 12 project teams that are working to transform our commercial corridors to be better places to live, work, and play. We celebrate the year-long effort by over 40 partners during the second year of Civic Lab. And we celebrate our region for being a testbed for innovation. Civic Lab was created in 2017 to change the way our region thinks about innovation, disruption, and risk. Civic Lab uses best practices from the private sector to design and launch pilot projects at a lower cost and on a faster timeline. Cross-sector teams represent public agencies, nonprofits, business and property owners, and community members that come together to participate in a year-long program. Teams identify a challenge, explore barriers and partnerships with the private sector, create a vision, and design small-scale, implementable pilot projects. Civic Lab is a challenge-first program. Teams participate in monthly workshops to find the root cause of the challenges they're facing, and from there, develop solutions. This year, that challenge is commercial corridor revitalization. Faced with property and business owner disinvestment, a lack of diverse housing, changing retail habits, and outdated policies that inhibit redevelopment, these challenges are vast. But transformation is on the horizon. The 12 project teams are creating the space for commerce and community to come together. Civic Lab has engaged brewery owners, cannabis growers, former mayors, city and county leaders, PBIDs, and forged a strong partnership with ULI Sacramento because so many in our region are invested in making these corridors succeed. Teams, along with 11 pre-qualified vendors and over 30 sub-consultants, will spend the next year implementing pilot projects that range from retail pop-ups to market analyses to zoning updates. These pilots will serve as catalysts for transformations to come. Join us in recognizing the 12 Civic Lab Year 2 project teams. In El Dorado County, Upper Broadway in the city of Placerville. In Sacramento County, Sunrise Marketplace in the city of Citrus Heights. Elk Grove Florin Road in the city of Elk Grove. East Bedwell Street in the city of Folsom. Main Street in the city of Ileton. Folsom Boulevard in the city of Rancho Cordova, and Del Paso and Stockton Boulevards in the city of Sacramento. In Sutter County, Bridge Street in the city of Yuba City. And in Placer County, Main Street in Meadow Vista, Harding Boulevard in the city of Roseville, and Taylor Road in the town of Loomis. Thank you again to ULI Sacramento, and congratulations to the second cohort of Civic Lab.
Okay. My first time with microphones, so just trying to figure out the technology. I really want to thank both the board for now 2 years of Civic Lab, and that's, we'll work on the technology. I want to thank the board for the first year and the second year of Civic Lab. If you remember, the first year was all about trying to figure out mobility challenges and transportation challenges, and what we've done with Civic Lab is really say, don't come with a solution, come with defining the problem that you're trying to solve. And the second year, as you know by now, and all of these teams behind us have been working on, is the challenge of revitalizing our old commercial corridors. One thing I think that unites every jurisdiction around the region is that you have old retail corridors, old commercial corridors. These were sometimes the old highways before the interstates were built that actually had all the old motels on them and the retail and the commercial. And those corridors are feeling a little underappreciation, a lack of love, and a lack of investment, frankly, over the last few decades. And as we think about growth, as we think about housing, as we think about small business, we think about startups, perhaps there is no better place than to think about repurposing and revitalizing and reinfusing some of these commercial corridors all around the region. This, I want to tell you, maybe even unlike the transportation topic and the mobility topic, is a really hard problem to try to solve. You've had 12 teams, incredibly diverse teams, as everywhere from Isleton to the city of Sacramento and the county of Sacramento. The teams have been at it for 9 months. They've been asking the hard questions. We had a marketplace back in May where we invited private sector vendors to come in. And again, a great role for council governments, aggregate those corridors all across the region, put them together, and try to get attention both from the state but also from private sector folks all over the country. And we did just that. We had over 50 vendors come into that open house. All your teams got to make quick pitches, which were fantastic, and we had developers and real estate folks and consultants from LA, New York, and Miami show up to that event. We put an RFQ out. You heard yesterday, if you were at the Futures Forum, probably one of the best innovations that we've stumbled across the last 2 years of Civic Lab is procurement. That sounds kind of boring and humdrum, but it is not. We believe that we've actually figured something out here by doing an umbrella RFQ and pre-qualifying private sector vendors that your teams can then pull right off, and then your local jurisdiction doesn't have to go through that procurement yourself. We had over 50 companies and vendors interested. We pre-qualified 11 teams that include over 30 sub-consultants. So those teams are now eligible for all of our Civic Lab teams to pull off and begin to work with. But again, I think you've taken on, and we've taken on, a really tough challenge in these older corridors. This is not easy. It's not going to happen overnight. Many of you are working on this, and Director Peters, you gave the opening yesterday in terms of Arden Way and the motel that you've transformed and worked so hard on. This is hard work. And so I think later today in the board meeting, you're going to hear a little bit of a proposal from us, inspired by the board leadership here, to make sure that we actually focus on implementing and helping our teams behind us actually get the resources and the planning assistance, the infrastructure dollars, the help from the state, and frankly also the help from all of you as local decision makers at cities and counties to begin to envision and actually see the success of the visions they've been developing. So they've been doing really, really hard work. They're taking on really hard challenges. And I think the thing that we all and you all should ask is, what does success now look like in the next 6 or 12 months? Because we need to spark things happening in these corridors. We want to see actual things on the ground, and we need to help them. They need help. But most importantly, and most of all, I just want to say a huge congratulations to the teams, the staff here at SACOG. I think it was another really successful effort, and the work in many ways is just beginning. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you, James.
Point of order. We have not taken roll call yet.
We haven't started the meeting yet.
Okay.
This is a pre-meeting activity.
I'll pull a point of order then.
All right. I guess we didn't want to officially calendar this, and I don't know. That's a good setup. So we are here. So this is, as James just said, obviously a critical thing for SACOG going forward. We made so much progress this year. I've seen some of these reports. I've seen some of these activities. I saw a little video before this video even. Very impressive stuff. Can't wait to see where we go next for the region. This is perhaps one of the most critical things we've undertaken as an organization. And I think, James, you're exactly right. It is a very heavy lift. I know in my jurisdiction, it's easy to say, well, here's one corridor, but I could name you 3 more also within my jurisdiction that are in need of sort of the same therapy, the same assistance, the same facilitation, the same attention. So, and all of us are probably in that condition of not just having one place, but probably several places that need work. So at this point, I think we are going to recognize graduates. Is that right? We're doing a little graduation at this point, or are we saving that for noon?
Have them stand up.
All right, Civic Lab team, year 2, stand up. Thank you all for being here. You want to hang with us through this meeting? We're gonna have a great lunch, and I guess, is everyone speaking at lunch, or how, is every team speaking at lunch? Is that that's the idea? Wonderful. So yeah, board members, other members of the public, you wanna stay, you're gonna get a great tutorial on that topic from 11 different agencies around the region. So I'm looking forward to that. At this point, do we have anything else to do pre-meeting? We have a quorum? Very good. So in that case, I'm gonna call this meeting to order. And we are going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Do I have a volunteer to lead the pledge? Director Veerkamp.
Please join us in pledge of allegiance. Military personnel salute. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much.
And roll call.
Thank you. Good morning. Today is Thursday, October 31st, 2019, and this is the SACOG board meeting. This meeting is live audio streamed and recorded for posting on the SACOG website. I did want to make a brief announcement before roll call about the microphones in front of you. Please don't pick them up, remove them. All you need to do when you would like to speak is to depress the button. The light will turn green. When you're done speaking, just push the button again. It'll turn back to red. So thank you. We are balancing sound, so please excuse some of the technical difficulties this morning, but we hope to have all of those worked out by our next meeting. And now for roll call, Director Allard.
Here.
Cabalden.
Here.
Douglas.
Present.
Flores. Here. Frost. Here. Gallardo. Here. Gore. Here. Harris.
Here.
Jankovitz.
Here.
Jennings.
Here.
Joyner.
Here.
Kennedy. Absent. Kozlowski.
Here.
Leahy.
Here.
Lozano.
Here.
New.
Here.
Onderco. Peters. Samayoa.
Here.
Saragosa. Absent. Saylor.
Here.
Chenier. Slowey.
Here.
Spokley.
Here.
Stallard. Soon.
Here.
Tixa.
Here.
Veerkamp.
Here.
West. Absent. Vice Chair Frericks. Chair Sander. And ex officio member Tacker for Benny Paul.
Here.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to move on to public communications. This is time for anyone who wishes to address the board on an item that does not appear on our agenda to make those comments. Does anyone have any public comments to make? I have no cards in front of me. Seeing none, we are going to move on to the consent calendar. These items are intended to be approved in one motion. However, anyone can remove an item for separate discussion. Staff has suggested we remove item number 5 for separate action because of a slight fault in the attachment that was sent in the packet in advance, so we will treat that one separately. The modified attachment is in your packet this morning, so without objection, I will remove item 5 from the consent calendar. So anyone have any other adjustments I'd like to make to that calendar? If not, I'm open to a motion.
Second.
Motion made and seconded about 5 times. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Very good. That was our consent calendar. We will now take up item 5 independently. Staff, do you have any comments on the alteration of the staff report?
It's slightly different than what went out in the board packet, but it is no change from what the committee recommended.
Okay. Board members, in case you're wondering where that voice came from, it's from right over here in this corner next to the giant light bulb. Very good. Are we getting a podium at some point, or is that going to be it?
The podium.
That is the podium.
We have a podium.
Boy, we are high style
It
now.
does raise, but it is
I
raisable.
say,
for-
very
yes.
good. Okay, that's our new podium. Any questions about item 5? Yes, Director Saylor.
The attachment that's in the board packet that we
Yes.
have before us has a timetable
Right.
for the procurement, and that timetable seems to be the one for the earlier process.
That is correct.
So
Director
is
Saylor.
there an amended timeline that's?
There is not. The action the Transportation Committee took was simply on the draft scope. We will be currently working out the draft schedule per any decision made this morning with the board. If the action is taken, we will then be working out a schedule. We anticipate the request for qualifications would go out within the week, and that we'd be awarding the contract no later than January of 2020.
Great, thank you.
Chair.
Director Suen?
Thank you. Not a question, but just a comment. I just want to thank you for bringing this forward and highlight the importance of this, especially I would say number 7, the governance question. A while back, many of the SACOG members, some of who are no longer are on this board, went up to Seattle to a transit conference and back to Denver, and I thought this was timely given the regional forum we had yesterday. Basically, just trying to figure out how we can get around better in this region. We having so many different transit agencies. I think Mayor Cabalden highlighted this on his panel. So many different transit agencies we have dealing with throughout the region, and just trying to this governance structure. This question to me is just very important in making us more making more of an efficient transportation system, so we can all get around easier. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, any other comments? Seeing none, I'm open to a motion.
Move to approve.
Second.
Keep your hand up, please, when you move. And second, very good. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. That is going to take us on to item number 12. Approval of board and committee meeting schedule for 2020, a highly controversial item.
Yeah.
Is there any report? No needed. No report needed. I hear a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Congratulations, we have a schedule. We are moving on to item 13. This one may have a few more comments. Draft regional housing needs allocation and methodology menu, and I think, Greg, you are up. Oh, look, the podium goes way up. And the light bulb disappeared.
Thank you. Greg Chu with the housing staff here at SACOG. With me is Dov Caden. We've been working on the regional housing needs allocation process for the past year, coming to the board, talking about the development of it, working with your housing planning staffs for the last year. And we have in the past mentioned how we developed 4 options for the board to consider. Today is a public hearing to talk about what those options are and to have an opportunity for public comment as well as board comment on any of those options. So I'm going to briefly go over what RENA is as well as the options, in part because the audience, this may be the first time that they've heard it in person. So the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RENA, is a state law since the 70s and seeks to ensure that we zone enough housing for all economic segments of the community throughout the state. So it's all communities throughout the state and all economic categories. It's a 3-part process. It involves the state, SACOG, and local governments. So the first part is the state determines how many units of housing it expects our 6-county region to grow in an 8-year period of time. The 8-year period of time is from 2021 to 2029 in this case. It determined that we have over 153,000 units that we're going to need to plan for and zone for during that 8-year period of time. That number came in earlier this summer. Now where we're at is what we're here for today, which is how do we as Council of Governments divvy that up to your local jurisdictions for allocation? What's the formula by which we're going to do that? And then what are the numbers associated with that? From there, after a series of actions that will culminate later in spring of 2020, your jurisdictions will officially receive the numbers, and then through your housing elements, you'll have to identify where there's opportunities for zoning enough lands that you're allocated. So the way the methodology works in concept is through our Metropolitan Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy, we have growth projections. These are our best understanding, working with your staffs on what you really expect for growth between 2016 and 2035. We've worked extensively with them through the MTP process. What we do there is we take the proportion of growth that each jurisdiction has. So if your jurisdiction has X% of the MTP SCS, then what we do for the RENA process is we give your jurisdiction X% of the 153,000 units. From there, we divide it up into 4 economic income categories. So these are defined by the state. So the 4 economic categories are very low income is 50% of median family income for your county. So for instance, if Sacramento County has a 4-person household income of median family income of $80,000, if you're a family of 4, if you have an income of $40,000 or less, you'd fall in that category. Between 50 and 80%, that's considered the low income category. And then there's moderate at 80 to 120%, and then above moderate at 120%. Why this matters, particularly, is in the lower income categories. That's the low and the very low income categories. So collectively, 80% of median family income or less. Those numbers that you receive for your allocation, that's what the jurisdiction must zone for multifamily. You have to come out with enough land to identify and zone for multifamily to accommodate that many units of housing. So the states equates density with affordability, and many people assume that at 30 units to the acre, it's a very large apartment complex. It doesn't necessarily have to be that. In some cases, depending on the size of the lot, you can do cottage apartments, fourplexes, townhouses, and so forth to meet that. The reason this is important is in this region, over 90% of the housing in this region is zoned for single-family housing. So there's 5 factors that the state requires that we put into the formula for the RENA. The first 2 we feel are covered in the MTP SCS. That's increasing housing supply and the mix of housing types, and to promote infill equity and environment. We feel that those are covered automatically in our MTP and just by the nature of that. But we have 3 other factors by which we have to consider. To improve jobs housing balance, including by wages, this is the proportion of lower income jobs compared to the amount of lower income housing that's available. If the proportion is way off, where there's a lot of low income jobs but very few low income housing, then a jurisdiction's adjustment number is going to go up. Second factor is what we call regional income parity. This is the amount of lower income housing, how many households are lower income relative to the rest of the region. If it's lower than the rest of the regions on average, then a jurisdiction's number is going to be adjusted upward, and vice versa. If a jurisdiction has a higher proportion of lower income households, then its allocation would be adjusted downward for the lower income category. And finally, a new state statute is on affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH. That's what we consider areas of opportunity. Areas that have really good schools, lots of jobs, good transit, things that we equate with as being more livable areas. Those areas that there's a state index for that, we look at that, and then again, if a jurisdiction is high in that category, then that jurisdiction should be taking in more lower income housing to adjust it. So here's how the formula works regardless of the 4 methodologies. So for starters, every jurisdiction receives 40.7% of their overall allocation starts in the low income category. 40.7% is what the regional average is. So from there, we take those 3 factors that I just discussed, and depending on where your jurisdiction is relative to the rest of the region for income parity, the areas of opportunity, and jobs housing fit, then we adjust it up or down. And then that gives us the amount of lower income category units that an jurisdiction would receive. So the four methodologies are variations of one another. They are in option A, there is a high emphasis on all three of those all three of those factors. In option B, we moderate all three factors. Options C and D are hybrids of A and B. In option C, we moderate the income parity, but we have a high impact, high emphasis for the areas of opportunity and the jobs housing fit. In option D, we moderate both income parity and areas of opportunity. So those four variations are of the same data. It's just a question of how much emphasis we place on them. SACOG staff is recommending option C. This recommendation is based on the feedback that we received after working with stakeholders and planning staffs from your local agencies for the past year. Option C is intended to be responsive to the concerns that we've received that there is a correlation between high wealth and high opportunity jurisdictions, which means there is a potential overlap between the regional income parity and the AFFH adjustment factors. Option C reflects those comments by slightly moderating the regional income parity. The region has many competing objectives that it's trying to balance. Vehicle miles traveled, economic development, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, preserving ag land, and others. Although option C is the staff's recommendation, staff believes that all four methodologies meet the intent of the state law and the state requirements. So on the timeline, the RENA and the housing element timelines are dependent on the adoption of the Metropolitan Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy. Your jurisdiction's housing elements are due 18 months after the adoption of the MTP SES. The board will be discussing an agenda item after this about potentially moving the adoption date of the MTP SES and its implications for RENA. Working backwards, though, the housing elements for local governments would be either due in May 2021 or August 2021. The staff would be seeking the board to select and approve one of four methodology options at its November 21st meeting. 3 days prior to that, the state's Housing and Community Development Department must issue its findings on the four draft methodologies. With the board approving one methodology at its November 21 meeting, jurisdictions will be given an opportunity to appeal their individual allocations following the state statutory process outlined here. Following the timeline, the Regional Housing Needs Plan, which wraps up the entire RENA process, would be adopted in April of 2020. This timeline has been shared with your planning staffs, and we've gone through it in detail with them, so you don't need to know all the ins and outs. There's lots of different variations depending on appeals and so forth. One key assumption for the timeline is that no new methodology or substantive revision to the existing methodologies is introduced for board consideration. A new methodology would trigger the restart of the 60-day mandatory review by the State Housing and Community Development Department. Your jurisdiction's housing elements due date remain the same regardless of when the SACOG board adopts the final methodology. So today's hearing is to provide an opportunity for the public, stakeholders, government agencies to comment on any of the RENA methodologies. Board members may also comment on the options. Staff will be available to clarify any methodologies and technical questions about the options, but will address any substantive policy comments in writing at the board November board action. Any written comments submitted to SACOG staff by November 8th will be responded to in writing and included in the staff report for the November 21st board meeting. We did receive 2 comments this morning in writing, one from the City of Sacramento, which I believe you have a copy of, as well as one from Housing Sacramento. I believe both parties are here to comment on those. And that concludes the staff report.
All right, thank you, Greg. With that, I'm going to open the public hearing. I have 3 cards in front of me with members of the public who wish to comment. The first is Kathy Cresswell. Kathy? Kathy will be followed by Ansel Lundberg, and Ansel will be followed by Jeffrey Tardigia.
Good morning. My name is Kathy Cresswell, and I'm here today representing the Sacramento Housing Alliance, which is a coalition of organizations working to advance housing in our region. We include faith groups, affordable housing developers, education groups, and a variety of community interests. We're here today to represent or to support staff's recommendation of Methodology C. We think it represents a fair and objective process that will create outcomes that will advance the region's prosperity and equity. The RENA process is critical to the local regional planning, and adequate planning for housing is critical for economic prosperity and equity in our region. It's also a perfect complement to the other work that you are doing to support regional economics. Planning adequately for housing now will ensure our region can get ahead of the problems that are hampering other regions in terms of their economic expansion because they don't have housing for their workforce. Other regions, Southern California and the Bay Area, for years have been fighting to provide adequate housing for their workforce, and they cannot retain or recruit workers. This region has an opportunity to get well ahead of that by adequately planning now for the housing that our future workforce needs and for other low-income households in the region who are a critical component of our communities. Methodology C meaningfully embraces also equity, and planning actually now more equitably will ensure we can right historic wrongs in how communities have been planned and segregated, and creating pockets of disinvestment and neighborhoods that are kept out of the prosperity. Adequately planning now will let us do that and ensure we have an adequate, prosperous future for all. So we really encourage you to support Methodology C and to work aggressively and effectively to address your affordable housing problems. We know that the numbers are significant and significantly higher than you've planned for before, but they represent the real need in this community. And we stand ready as an organization. We have some of the most effective affordable housing developers in the nation in this region. So you have assets that you can take advantage of to make sure that you can adequately meet these needs. And our organization stands ready to work with any city in this region to help you get to where you can plan to meet your needs. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. Ansel Lundberg.
Hello, good morning, SACOG board. My name is Ansel Lundberg. I'm with House Sacramento. We are a Yes in My Backyard group that advocates for dense, transit-oriented infill development in the region. And I just want to say thank you for having this public hearing to have a discussion, important discussion about this, and thank you for staff's hard work on the proposal and the menu for the methodology. So I just want to say, first of all, also, I'm excited about SACOG stepping up and boldly accepting the overall RENA allocation from the state. It is a bigger number than before, but it is ambitious, and I think it's really important that that happened. There are other regions that are struggling with that, and I think it's a good sign that SACOG is ready to step up and handle a larger allocation. So I also want to say that there's an implication in the allocation of that larger number to the individual jurisdictions, and that is based around SACOG's MTP SCS, and that focuses growth in urban areas as opposed to exurban sprawl, and I think that's something to be commended as well. Finally, so I just want to say how Sacramento actually supports option A in the methodology menu, which is, I understand, not the staff recommendation, but we think that it's time to continue making bold steps, and option A will allow for a higher impact from the adjustment factors that are required by recent legislation. So thank you, and as was mentioned, we have submitted more detailed email comments, so thank you again.
Very good, thank you. And Jeffrey. good to see you at the event yesterday, Jeffrey.
Board, I will say thank you. It was a good, yesterday was, I consider, a good session to, so I'm going to step back and offer to you, say, is another organization called the American Medical Association. For more than 10 years, they knew that, should we say, vitamin D was needed, but it took 10 years before the comment. How is that relevant? Well, right now you have where the master aging plan is looking at, and so for the next 20, 30 years, we expect the, should we say, senior population to more than double. By 2050, we're expecting temperatures over 100 degrees. Today, 1, accessibility. 2, under $1,000 renters. The retired community. For 50 years, Sacramento has been a big retirement community. I don't see those adequately addressed. The other thing I will say is right now new information was coming out of the master plan. The next meeting will be November 4th, that they will meet for the second time to come together. The other thing you need to be listening to, not so much for Sacramento, but for the rest of the region, what is coming out of the CAL FIRE? The reason I bring that up to you is because they definitely suggested that you need to plan housing in a different manner in relationship to our wildfire dangers. Next thing will be coming through there is, you say, the idea of wind maps through there so we know a better understanding. The insurance aspect, the impacts those are having on housing, fire, flood, and the fact that you just homeowners insurance in building. These are not part of your, but it is something that, you know, you need to see over the next 50 years of how much things are changing, and are you doing the best job here for the region? We are forward thinking, we are innovative thinking. We need to consider what is changing and watching how quickly things are changing, because innovation and motivation and how you deal with under $1,000 renters, because that is going to be the largest community you expect over the next 20 years. You all dealing with workforce and the other aspects, please remind and remember that accessibility, universal design, these are concepts I don't see incorporated in your thinking through here. Please consider it to be extremely important for your coming community and for the fact that we are expecting higher temperatures.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Any other public comments? Seeing none, I'm going to close the public hearing. Board members, comments or questions? Mr. Suen.
Thank you, Chair. Greg, I was wondering, in terms of these adjustment factors, I understand there can be a lot of overlap between the three. Is that?
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any insights on that?
Yes, so out of the three, we consider the areas of opportunity and the regional income parity to be very similar. For that reason, we felt like we were double counting those factors, and that's why we, in option C, we suggested moderating the regional income parity.
And then along those lines, why wouldn't we just moderate all three in order to equalize the factors rather than putting a slightly higher weight on one or two?
Well, we felt in order to meet the spirit of what the law was to emphasize as many factors as we could without double counting them. So after a long discussion amongst staff, we felt that option C, having those two options on opportunity areas of opportunity as well as jobs, housing, fit, better furthered what we're trying to do with not just the RENA, but with the MTP and the SES.
I see. Thank you.
Christopher?
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Greg and Devin for the work on this. I'm actually personally supportive of option A. Maybe I'm a YIMBY. We don't really have that many NIMBYs in my city, so and the equity issues are significant. So I'm personally supportive of that direction. But I guess I have a couple of comments I wanted to make about the ambition of what's proposed here. And I should say for my own city, this makes no difference whatsoever. All the methodologies produce the same number within 1%. So it's of no consequence to me whatsoever in terms of whether I have to build 3,590 or 3,595. It doesn't really make any difference. And that's largely true for the city of Sacramento too. So I know we've received the letter from the city manager there, but all of the RENA numbers, all four methodologies produce basically the same number for the city of Sacramento as well. And not surprising, just given the demographics, the income profile, the jobs profile of both of our cities. And I continue to have some of the questions around my neighbor to the west and Davis. I think the staff report does a really good job of describing the group quarters issues and the challenges that Davis has in its inability to zone, UC Davis itself. But the regional income parity adjustment doesn't adequately account for the student population. So you're essentially creating opportunities for, there's no opportunities for low and middle skill workers to expect to have housing in that community because it's all accounted for in the students on the production side. And it's why we're seeing some significant pressure in my city for workers in that category. So I know the city of Davis is working very hard on this. It's not a knock on Davis at all, but the methodology ought to, as we're going forward into the future, the methodology ought to do a better job of accounting for the warping effect of students. Like if the point is to get to regional income parity in some far future, and Davis will always be a university town, one would hope, then it cannot have precisely the same economic profile in terms of housing and still have the same level of equity. It just can't because it's the sheer number of students. So I think we need to get at that issue. Whether this is a good start, but I think either this time or in future rounds we should get sharper and sharper around that question. The methodological and arena, more generally, because the Housing Sacramento and the House Sacramento, these are distinct groups. I'm understanding. Because I think we need your help too in this space. The relationship between multifamily housing and low and moderate income housing, which RENA is based on, because we don't zone for low income housing. We zone for multifamily and other forms of density. And multifamily has always been a reasonable proxy of income, not perfect for sure, but always reasonable. But that was before the great shift back to urban places and to downtown Roseville and elsewhere, where we're building, luxury apartments and luxury condos that are multifamily, but are not, but are the farthest thing possible from the income profiles that we're talking about. So the methodological changes in RENA have to keep getting better because that's becoming increasingly a poor signal of affordability. Simply looking at the density piece for good reasons, for all the reasons that we've described, why we did the blueprint and why our SCS looks the way that it does. Second is that zoning doesn't equal permits. And so for my YIMBY friends and for Housing Sacramento, who have picked up the mantle from our Bay Area neighbors and our LA neighbors, we do not have the same issue. The barrier to the construction of additional housing and affordable housing in the Bay Area is a failure to zone. And it is largely driven by NIMBYs, but it is a failure to zone for it. That's not our problem here. Yeah, we have jurisdictions and we have times, we have specific parcels and neighborhoods where zoning doesn't get to where its highest and best use ought to be, for sure. But that's not our main problem. I have 10,000 units zoned. The problem is I can't get them financed. Developers cannot build them. And so simply zoning more defeats the whole purpose of zoning. And I'll tell you why. If I have a responsibility to add zoning for an additional 10,000 units, that means I would pick the next area on my list would be the west end of West Capitol Avenue. Maybe I also deal with this Davis issue. So pick the west end of West Capitol Avenue. So I'd start zoning, which our plan is in 10 or 15 years to start zoning that for high density mixed use development. But if I zone that now, then I have a responsibility to start providing infrastructure for that at the high density mixed use level now. I need to plan and divert transit resources to that area now. I need to build bike lanes there now. I don't have the resources, and I never will, to build simultaneously the entire community for high density mixed use development all at once. In fact, the purpose of zoning is to set a sequence of priorities over time. And so I really would urge the YIMBY and pro-housing advocates to consider the notion of space and time, and not simply the idea that we should zone everything all at once, because that's the Bay Area's problem. If I could finance it, it would be great, but I cannot. And so the second problem with that is every single project, no matter how great the developer is, that's been coming in for a permit for the last 5 years has been, this is great, we love your plan, we love the transit, we like the waterfront, all the amenities are great. Your ambition to build this parcel at 8 stories is a little much. So we're coming in with a 2-story project or a 3-story project, and someday the neighborhood will be ready for 8 stories, but it's not today. Every single project is coming in at half or a quarter of the density that we've zoned for. That has enormous implications. It means that we're consuming, if we do SB 50 and what some of the advocates are saying, it would mean we would consume 100% of our permanent capacity right now at a significantly lower density. So we take all the land and build half as much density on it. That is not the solution to the need for housing or for housing affordability. And so if we don't match up the market, our ability to build, not just our ability to zone, with some of these projections and policies and mandates that are coming from the state, we're going to be shooting ourselves and the next generation in the foot. They are not going to have the capacity that we need, and it's killing us right now. I mean, we're saying no to projects because they're coming in too low at too low of a density. But we would not be able to if the legislature said, hey, if the thought of high density ever crosses your mind, then the developer has by right to go build there tomorrow. Even the notion, if it ever crosses your mind, they have by right at that point. No matter what, this is a major problem. And so I'm calling, I just want to call out my friends in the housing community because, one, I think option A is better, but two, we're not going to get, if we don't attend to the specific market dynamics of inland California and not allow San Francisco and LA to drive state policy around this, we are going to be causing some significant damage to housing affordability and equity in this and other regions in the valley. So thanks to the staff, they've done a great job here. I don't want to over dramatize it because the variation's not that wide, but it is a strong step forward. But we're not going to be able. The numbers alone are not going to self-build if we don't address the infrastructure and financing issues that are underlying it.
All right, Director Schneer.
Thank you, Chair. So I want to take a slightly different track on this. So you all have a letter from Howard Chan, our city manager. I hope you have a chance to read it. Just a couple things. I think this really points up why SACOG is so important and why this board is so important. And there are a lot of folks, I think, who haven't gone through this exercise before. And we've had some of this discussion, but when this board has the ability to think in the big picture and regionally. If we were only thinking about the city for Sacramento from this point, we would say, no, we can't take more than our share of population. But if all we're doing is looking at this by population, then it wouldn't work, and it wouldn't be the best thing for the region in the long run. So for us, we are certainly taking steps towards doing much more housing. We've created a space in our bureaucracy for housing. We've hired a couple people. Sorry, Roseville, we took one of yours. But we also are moving forward with a $100 million bond to do affordable housing in our area because we know there's state money and we know we need the local match on it. So we're probably at 30% of the new housing and 20% of the population. That's something that we think we should do, being the core of the city. But my only point here is as we move forward on other types of funding, to think about that as well. So we can't just do like a straight population and split everything that way. We need to think of the costs and benefits of handling more or less of your share and moving forward in that direction.
Director Stewart.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to spare my policy committee colleagues the repeat of, but Mayor Cavalden, you basically inspired me. You know, just to add on to what was stated earlier, in a community like mine in Elk Grove, suburban community, we've had property zoned for affordable housing for 20 years. 20 years. And it's being able to complete the deal. It's being able to get the financing. As you all know, the TCAC rounds only twice a year. It's highly competitive. If you're in a suburban community like mine, you don't necessarily have transit or the services that are needed next to these facilities yet. So the challenge, you know, of actually implementing whatever RENA number and plan that we adopt in our housing element, it's very difficult. And so I just want to highlight that because we're going through the exercise of having the plan, having the numbers, but we haven't gotten to a way to actually address the need. And financing is a big part of it. As Mayor Cabalden noted, a lot of our communities have the zoning. And I would even say, you know, CEQA issue isn't necessarily a challenge for us either. I mean, a lot of us have processed things pretty well. But again, it's the financing, it's getting the deal between the landowner and the affordable housing developer. It's a different business model than your typical residential family unit. And so, and I think Director Chenier made a good point about, you know, what Sacramento's doing, getting some bond financing for their local contribution. Our city does something similar, assessing market rate builders, and we've developed a big pot that we continually loan out. But I still think there's more that we can do, and maybe this is a segue into this body playing that role across the street and with our own policy and innovation committee. Maybe, you know, we can look to develop a implementation plan that we can then, you know, shop around and gain support for. So I'll pose that to this board, and again, having SACOG be a leader in the state to actually implement this plan, because again, we're different from LA, from the Bay Area. I think we have to develop our own model going forward. Thank you.
All right, very good. Any other comments? Vice Chair?
Yeah, thank you. So a couple quick points. First, I appreciate staff's work on this. You know, Greg and Dov and Kirk were at a recent Davis City Council meeting. We had a joint meeting with our Planning Commission as well and had a public workshop on RENA and discussion of it. And so very much appreciate that, and lots of conversation, particularly lots of public comment. But they're still here to tell the tale, so that's good. I think particularly to Mayor Cabalden's comments. I mean, I think you're right on many of your points. I think that it's interesting. The one thing that's fascinating, I think a lot of people don't really recognize in terms of this group quarters issue, was discussed very well in the staff report. You know, the universities in California, UC specifically, but CSUs, you know, are not given any RENA, right, allocations, even though they create housing and create lots of and house lots of people. So that it's interesting because, you know, so Davis and Yolo County specifically most recently, but we're seeing effects in other communities, of course, West Sacramento, Woodland, Winters, further down in Solano County, Vacaville and such, and then of course over here in Sacramento. You know, the reality is there are a lot of individuals who do live on campus. About 27% of students live on campus, but UC Davis in particular is the largest UC by land area with 5,000 acres, and they have a lot of ability to take on more housing on campus, and they are starting to do so. They actually are building about 5,000 units of housing over the course of the next 5 or 6 years. And we have been working particularly but those units are not counted explicitly. They're sort of somewhat embedded in some of the methodology, but they're not in the city of Davis. They are technically in Yolo County, but Yolo County does not receive any credit for those units, as the way that RENA is set up currently with the state. I should also mention HCD was also present at the meeting at the city council meeting, and appreciated their participation as well too. One thing that we are working on, and this affects, I mean, all jurisdictions, whether not just sort of student-oriented housing or not, but in Davis we have entitled about 2,000 new units of housing over the course of the past 3 or 4 years. And as Mayor Cabalden correctly pointed out, entitling it or zoning for it does not necessarily mean it gets built. Aside from the issues of financing, there are also numerous lawsuits that seem to crop up in an attempt to either slow down or stop the housing that is approved by the local governments. I think that the issue that does crop up, though, and it's an issue in all of our jurisdictions, is this issue of unit equivalency and sort of getting credit there. So, for example, in Davis, we are building we've entitled several student-oriented apartment complexes, apartment complexes that are in the range of 3, 4, and 5 bedroom apartment complexes, and in some cases even 6-bedroom apartment complexes. But a 1-bedroom unit and a 5-bedroom unit are each considered one unit. But clearly there is a difference between a 1-bedroom apartment and a 5-bedroom apartment. And so we are working with SACOG staff and HCD staff and Department of Finance and several of the local governments in Yolo County to try and figure out how there is an ability to maybe get some sort of credit for if we are building, for example, larger apartment projects. So that's just one issue I wanted to point out. And I think that really the real key in all of this too is the continued advocacy for state funding to, accelerate infill in our region, particularly whether it's the Green Means Go proposal that SACOG is advocating for, but really just a call to all jurisdictions to, and we've been, a lot of us have been engaged in these discussions already, but to continue to participate in working with our sort of regional legislative delegation, but also as we, and Director Soon mentioned, the Policy and Innovation Committee, but we're going to continue these efforts. Obviously, we've hired representation here at SACOG here in the past month or two to really help advocate for trying to fight for additional dollars for our region for doing the right type of growth in the right types of places. And then just a call to the outside organizations, sort of our partner organizations, but whether it's the Sacramento Housing Alliance or House Sacramento, if you haven't yet supported Green Means Go as a program, a pilot program that we are working on here vis-a-vis SACOG, I hope you will, because it's something that's worth supporting, and we actually have a real ability to bring additional much-needed dollars and state resources to help us all achieve the goals and objectives of RENA.
All right, very good. Any other comments? Yes.
Thank you. Like the others, I appreciate the staff work and the tremendous amount of work, and I know we've been working on it in our city as well. One of the challenges is when you come up with a formula and then you plug it in and then we get the results is what I would call a reality check. Rockland has not done a good job in building anything multifamily, and especially for our low income. I'm going to be the first to say that. We just didn't. It was something that I think obviously we needed to do and we want to do. I think that's the big piece, is we absolutely want to do that. And I appreciate the folks that mentioned about getting it built is the challenge. But here's the challenge we have, and I looked, and I'm looking at, for instance, the El Dorado County unincorporated area and looking at Rockland. So we have similar total RENA numbers for a goal. But El Dorado County is 1,786 square miles, and they are about 90 people per square mile density. Rockland's 20 square miles, and we're almost 3,000 people for density, and we're basically built out. So now I have this number, and somebody in the audience talked about create outcomes. I want to create an outcome, but the reality is I don't have very much space. We are basically built out. So we go through this process and say, I need 120 acres. Where am I going to get it? Changing commercial to high-density residential puts the city at risk, because that's what we're going to be built out, and that's what we will be living on to continue the service level we have. So then the next step was, well, let's go and rezone areas that you have that are older, and then they'll get rehabbed. So give you a little bit of history. When my mother-in-law was born in her home on Pacific Street in Rockland, the population was 500. When my husband was born 40 years later, the population was about 1,400. In 2000, I think we were 36,000 people, and now we're 70,000 people. We're really new. I can tell you all day long that I'm going to go rezone our older areas, but it's not going to happen in our lifetime. It's too new. And so somewhere in there, we need some help to figure out or even just to acknowledge the physical issue of what do you do if you don't have the physical space to build that number of units. And I think that's then, hopefully then, we will do that reality piece because we want the units built. So I think there's that piece of we really do have to look at each area. I know Lincoln and Rockland have similar numbers, and we're about similar size, but again, your density's much, much lower. So you may have some opportunities. You've got some space. I don't have 126 acres of open space.
So Jill, since you brought it up, and thanks for bringing it up, I got to advocate a little bit here for the city of Placerville as well as El Dorado County. A lot of us don't have the space or don't have the topography that would be consistent with some of these plans. As these numbers were started to be developed, our staff with SACOG staff and our board input was a little inconsistent to start with because the numbers were here and we're saying where, how, as well as, okay, we'll stack them in these areas, but then we're going to burn them up. So I think the state has to be a little bit more realistic in some of this stuff as well, because some of it's not achievable. And that's where I think a body such as SACOG needs to advocate for some reality check, as you put it, because it's just not achievable. And yes, we know there's numbers of need out there, but again, that's all the more reason for densities and so forth in the areas that it can be done. And then that begs the question too, and that's why I am, and our board is leaning towards option C, is income parity isn't going to be parity. I'm sorry, and that's another reality check. It's just never going to be unless we're going to be a socialistic society, and I don't think that's ever going to happen. That's it.
Any other comments? All right, I think it's a wrap on that item. We did our public hearing, had a lot of comments back for staff. This will be coming back to us in November. All right, very good. We are going to move on to item number 14, our 2020 Commercial Corridor Task Force. And Monica, I think you are up for this item.
Good morning, thank you. It was no accident that we timed these two in this order. It's very clear that the board really wants to figure out how to build more housing. And over the last year with our Civic Lab team, we've been able to bring forward, sorry, this is, am I as loud as I think I am? Okay. So I'm bringing forward this Commercial Corridor Task Force for 2020. It's an ad hoc committee with a recommendation of a public-private partnership. In the discussion prior to this, we heard that everybody at the local level is really trying to do what they can in addition to zoning, but many of the projects you want to see hit the ground are not penciling. And being able to bring the private sector into a cohort with you to start talking about this and hearing from them, I think would be very beneficial. Attachment A is a draft charge of what the task force would do, including the makeup. We're intentionally trying to form a smaller size task force, one so it's a little bit more manageable, that would come through and report through the Land Use and Transportation Committee. So that would then be the filter that would potentially bring larger issues, opportunities, or information to the full board for discussion and deliberation. The task force is also a little bit about changing hearts and minds around the region for other entities to really look at commercial corridors as not just a place for opportunity, but for SACOG, a really important place to help us meet our greenhouse gas emission targets, creating walkable and bikeable areas, creating places and identity. And what that commercial corridor intensification looks like around the region is really different. If you were at the forum yesterday, you got to see some examples of what's really becoming kind of a town center on Fair Oaks Boulevard. As a native Sacramentan, if I go over to Fair Oaks Boulevard and I'm on one side of the street, there's things I want to do on the other side, and I can't get there without getting in my car. And so those types of efforts really are important, so I can go spend more money in those shops. And it's a real opportunity because right now in our commercial corridors, with the loss of big box, we're seeing a lot more of local businesses trying to start up in there. But if you're just there and that's a place where you're going to just do chores, you're not thinking about spending time and more money there with your families. So
I don't want to spend too much time. I know we have a very important workshop ahead of us today, but I'm happy to answer questions about the charge, talk a little bit more about what the structure would look like. Again, it's a 12-month ad hoc committee. We imagine a small group that would include private members and quarterly meetings. So it's going to be quick. It's going to be really targeted. We also really are looking for support in identifying local policies and strategies to help implement Civic Lab Year 2 pilot projects, as well as really strategizing for more funding for those pilot projects. With that, I'll stop and take
All
any
right,
questions
very good.
or comments.
Comments or questions? Board members? Seeing none, I'm open to a motion.
I'll move it.
Motion made and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, staff. That is bringing us to the information part of our agenda, and item 15 is adoption of the schedule for 2020 Metropolitan Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy, and is it Clint?
Christina.
Christina.
Christina Lockey and Clint's
Christina
gonna
is up.
join me. After I go, we're gonna kind of tag team this.
Tag team it.
So we wanted to provide an update on the Safe Vehicles Rule, which is the federal changes in gas emissions standards. Some of you have received an update at the Policy and Innovation Committee and Strategic Policy Committee meetings, but not everybody has since our last board meeting, so I want to start a little bit from the beginning so everybody's on the same page. Since our last board meeting, the federal administration did take action to begin implementation of the Safe Vehicles Rule. And if it isn't complicated enough, we now have a new name. It's called the One National Program Rule. And what the administration did was it began to implement parts of the Safe Vehicles Rule and withdraw California's Clean Air Waiver. And so they're calling that portion of it the One National Program Rule. So on September 19th, the federal administration issued its final action. The next day, California, along with 22 states, the District of Columbia, and 2 cities sued. So there is now ongoing legal action related to this. The rule has been published and will take effect on November 26th. This means that starting November 26th, the federal government will not approve our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, or our MTP, because the tool used to model vehicle emissions and show that we can attain our clean air goals will be invalid because of the new rules that will have taken effect. So if we do not have a plan when our current MTP expires in March, there are numerous impacts both at the federal level and at the state level. They're outlined more specifically in Attachment A, but I want to just provide a little bit of a brief overview. On the federal side, after expiration of the 2016 plan in March, there is a 1-year grace period starting in March, during which projects using federal funds could continue as long as they're consistent with our 2016 plan. So they could continue, but any changes to scope, schedule, any changes to the projects could mean that they could not move forward because it's based completely off of what's in the 2016 plan. After the grace period expires in March 2021, if there still isn't a new model to show we can attain our clean air goals, and there is a possibility of that, then certain projects would not be able to move forward at all. At the state level, without an MTP, that means we also don't have a Sustainable Community Strategy, or SCS, and therefore jurisdictions would not be able to compete for certain state funding programs. Additionally, some of SACOG's formula funds could be at risk. So there's a lot of risk for not having an approved plan by March, but starting November 26th, we cannot adopt a new plan. So we have been working internally to talk about what the options are for SACOG and for the region in terms of transportation projects. Option 1, we could move forward as planned, which as of right now is not realistic because as of right now, we would not be able to adopt in February. If we were going to move forward and adopt in February, that would mean that the state and federal governments would have completed a new model, which again could take a couple of years to do. So the likelihood that that could be expedited is extremely slim. And on the state side, related to the Sustainable Community Strategy, if we wanted to try to move forward and adopt just that, that would require state legislation. It would have to be an urgency clause so that it takes effect by March, and that requires a 2/3 vote of the legislature. So again, a slim chance for something like that to happen as well. Our other option is to advance adoption of our plan. We now have a deadline to work off of. We know that November 26th is
November 25th is when we have to have our plan adopted and approved by the federal government. This is a extremely tight deadline in order to act. However, luckily enough, we had originally designed our calendar for our February adoption to provide a lot of leeway in terms of allowing us to adopt in February. So there is a possibility and a route for us to adopt our plan earlier than February in order to address all of these risks that happen if we don't adopt by March. So Clint Holton is going to provide an update on the calendar and what it looks like to advance our adoption date.
Thanks. So at the September board meeting, we released our draft plan, our EIR, conformity analysis. We released the whole package of documents for a 45-day public review that will end on November 7th. So that's been our plan all along, that we would wrap up our public review by November 7th. What we're proposing to do with this accelerated schedule would be to take those public comments, make final changes to the plan, to the EIR, respond to those comments, and then get a staff report to you so that you can consider adoption on November 18th in a special board meeting. That would allow a 7-day review period for our federal and our state partners, who we've been working very closely with up to this point, to make sure that that is a feasible option. It's by no means a guarantee, but they are willing to work with us to get that approval done by November 25th, which gets us a federally approved plan just ahead of this One National program going into effect. Part of the reason, so we do have the ability to do this, part of the reason there's been such a gap in our schedule between a November 7th planned close of our public comment period and a February adoption is we didn't want to bring the public comment period in through the holiday season. So we had already planned on having this as a fall November 7th close. So we're not changing public review. All of our formal public review, all of that happens. We had our workshops leading up to this. We had our elected officials meetings leading up to this. So really what is changing is just that time between the closer review and bringing you a final plan. So the other thing of note with this accelerated schedule, as Greg alluded to earlier, is the process for the regional housing needs allocation, the plan, the deadline for the plan, and the deadline for the update to the housing elements are keyed off of the adoption of your MTP-SCS. So those would also move up so that the housing needs plan, which is a SACOG responsibility, would be due in May of 2020. The housing elements would then be due 18 months after we adopt the plan, so in May of 2021. So those are kind of the big overall schedule changes. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have about how this is going to work right now. This item is also coming to your committees next week for additional discussion with all of you.
Information item, any questions for staff, any information needed? Yes.
Can I renew my question from last time, which is what is stopping us from going on parallel tracks and having a plan that is acceptable after that date and a plan that's on this accelerated schedule to have a plan that's acceptable, before that date?
What prevents us from adopting in February with this rule specifically? Is that the...
So you've made perfectly clear the logic for adopting prior to November 26th. Yeah. I get that.
Yeah.
But the discontinuity between what the future requirements will be for the federal and what the state requirements will remain to be, what is the harm in going down parallel tracks and having a plan that satisfies the federal requirements and has an appendix that satisfies the California requirements? The fact that this second piece exists would invalidate the first. That seems incredibly specific in its, sort of requirement.
I'm not sure that I quite get the question, but I think this might answer it, which is the state requires compliance with federal Clean Air Act requirements. So we can't actually adopt a stateside plan without meeting the federal requirements. It's built into the state statute.
Okay.
So once the One National Program rule becomes effective, we can neither adopt a federal plan, nor a state plan, nor a sustainable community strategy. We're stuck unless we get state legislation that says...
Because the One Nation plan says you can't do any of those things?
Yeah, because what it does is it invalidates the MFAC, which is the emissions factor model, which allows us to determine conformity with the Federal Clean Air Act. That's what the revocation does, that because it changes the fuel standards, right? The waiver that California was operating under, it says you can't do that anymore, and that means our emissions modeling that we use for our state implementation plans for air quality, that we use for conformity for all of our transportation plans, all of that's invalid at the moment.
Because there is no federal model?
Because there's no federally approved model, that's correct.
Okay. That was my underlying question, is the real rub here is that not only did they take away the California waiver, but did not provide an alternative calculation methodology.
The procedure is that it's the state's requirement to develop a model, and then the feds approve it. But given that this change in law
so the naming of this legislation is fallacious.
Oh, you bet.
And it's not a one nation plan. It's not that plan.
Yeah, it's not California.
Okay, I got you.
So I will say, I mean, we have a good partnership with the ARB, and we've been talking to them. And the first comment we got was it's going to take us a couple of years to develop this new model, emissions model. They're now accelerating that, and they're trying to get it done within a couple of months. The problem is it requires the approval of the feds. And our view is we can't count on the federal government to approve any work we do. The last time we had a model approved, it took 1.5 years. So we could be stuck for a very long time in this. And hence why we're going through all of this effort to see if we can thread the needle. We're going to need some help, but we're trying.
I can run a copy machine.
Any other questions?
My question relates to the regional housing needs assessment and having to move up our schedule in fulfilling our requirements there after the MTP SCS is passed. And it's my understanding that that's going to be a push for my jurisdiction, for the county. And I wonder if after we pass the MTP, does SACOG relax a little? Is there any resources that you can offer the jurisdictions to help us in that process? Because that's going to be a possible budget impact for us to fulfill the RENA sooner, and we're all on tight budgets.
I'll see if Greg might want to add to this, but we did go out and make sure that before we came here today, we reached out to all the housing planners just to give them the heads up of this potential implication. When we did that, we didn't hear any major concerns with just the timing of it, but to get to your question, in terms of our ability to go out and help jurisdictions with this, I think we are committed absolutely to doing that in any way we're able, with technical assistance, with staff time, anything that we can do to help your jurisdictions get through that housing element update. Did you want to add anything?
Yes, we have been working with your jurisdictions. They do know about the potential change in the calendar. There are concerns about it. This so happens to be an opportunity where we have the SB1 funds as well as the SB2 funds, as well as the governor's housing funds. So those monies are available to all jurisdictions. As my understanding is, every jurisdiction is taking advantage of those opportunities to get consultants and technical assistance to help you with your housing elements.
Oh, so there will be funding?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, great, thank you.
Christopher?
Yeah, look, there's only so much you guys are going to be able to solve with this. I think you know. I mean, this onion is going to get peeled further and further back. So, I mean, RENA is a great example. There are because it's fundamentally not a modeling question. It's if we don't have California's standards for fuel efficiency and for emissions, then we can't. It's that gigantic boost in emissions that causes us to fail conformity. But it has other implications too. So for example, under RENA, I'm not supposed to be zoning multifamily affordable housing in commercial corridors in which there is too much vehicle pollution from trucks and too much traffic. Right? I'm supposed to care for the public health impacts of too much emissions. So now if I've got to look at the federal standards instead of the state standards for cars and for light-duty vehicles for trucks, it may affect the inventory of sites that I have available for RENA. So, the implications of this are far more than just a modeling thing that that we'll be able to resolve at the staff level. They're big ones for a lot of our planning efforts more generally. So I appreciate. I'm very supportive of doing this. We've gone through a quick light conformity lapse before, and it's not pretty, and this one would be much worse. The other dimension, though, other than the suspension of the SES requirements and all of that, we're not the only region facing these problems. We are the only one on this very specific time frame at the moment, but other regions are also in the process of revising their MTPs and their SESs, and they're all doing RENA and everything else. And so it's certainly foreseeable that there'll be at least one, maybe 100 different pieces of legislation trying to reconcile this issue in the next session, one of which could include an extension of the housing element for 4 months or whatever. So I think that particular problem is probably the least of ours right now. But just to put that into Christina's list of, and into Eric's list of things that, we ought to try to get fixed in the legislature that may not require 2/3 urgency vote, but that is eminently doable.
All right. Anything else on this item?
Chair Sander, if I could, I just wanted to draw your attention to the calendar that's in your attachments on this. So I think by now that we have scheduled a special board meeting Monday, November 18th at 10 a.m. November 18th is the first day we can officially adopt the MTP SES. Hence, we're trying to get every hour in that week as we possibly can. Our comment period will close November 7th. As Clint said, we will be responding to all the comments on the EIR on Friday, November the 8th. That starts a 10-day clock to November 18th. In advance of the November 18th special board meeting, with all the documents you're going to get from us, this staff will be doing everything they can, including working over that weekend of the 9th and the 10th and the 11th on Veterans Day, to get you materials in advance. But I want to tell you, please be patient. I hope we're doing pretty good on getting you materials far in advance now of your board meetings and your committees. But we're going to have to we're going to balance having enough substance for you to review with needing some time that week to actually put it all together. So plan on Wednesday the 13th or Thursday the 14th to be getting a packet to review for the board meeting on the 18th, which is where you will take up adoption of the MTP SES. And this is the best avenue, I think you all understand by now, that we believe we have in order to get adoption. One might say it's like, say, the Washington Nationals winning the World Series back in May, but things are possible. So stay tuned, but we think this is the best path right now, and we will try to be in communication with you in terms of when we can get you those materials in advance, and they will be long, but I also hope through this acceleration of this process that feels like it's very arbitrary and under the deadline of a new federal mandate, that there is very important substance in this MTP SES, and we should not forget that.
All right, very good. Thank you, James. We are going to move on to our workshop item, Wildfire Preparedness and Public Safety. And Mr. Shabazian, or should I say Director Shabazian, or is it Secretary Shabazian?
No, not yet.
Deputy Governor Shabazian, something. Mr. Shabazian, welcome.
Thank you. This workshop is a follow-on to the tour that we did up in El Dorado County back in June. And just to kind of set that one up, it was about a year ago that we all experienced the Camp Fire, not just the city of Paradise, but basically the whole Central Valley and many parts of California experienced the Camp Fire. And it was this board, at that time, that this board asked the question, what are we here at SACOG doing about forest management and these wildfires? We do have forest management in the RUCS portfolio. We elevated that and started working on it more diligently. And basically brought to you a white paper as well as this tour that we did in June. That tour was a good way for folks to learn about forest health and why our forests aren't as healthy as they could be and what it takes to get them there and the impacts of that. So we heard from impacts on the watershed. So our water supply and our power supply are all dependent now on
our forests being healthy, and you're going to hear some more about that today in the context of flood control. So building off of that tour, and we'll hear more about what's going on in El Dorado County from Supervisor Veerkamp, who is part of the panel today to talk to you about preparedness. So building upon that tour, we wanted to talk more specifically about wildfire preparedness, both within our communities and throughout our region, and also, of course, public safety. This is a snapshot of the zones according to the Public Utilities Commission, and the risk or threat within those zones due to utility-related wildfires. That looks very similar to what CAL FIRE uses to look at hazard severity zones. So as you can see, between these two maps, a very good part of our region, a big chunk of that is in these elevated or extreme zones for risk. When we look at the numbers and the potential loss of buildings and maybe life, we have currently today over 66,000 dwelling units within these zones according to the PUC map, about 15,000 jobs, and our forecast is in the future we're pushing 75,000 dwelling units and almost 19,000 jobs. So that's what's at risk. I just wanted to set that context for the conversation that we're going to have today with our panelists. Of course, when there is an event, those people need to get out of those areas and to somewhere safe. We would think that these highways and other major roadways are de facto evacuation routes, and they are, but we'll learn that they don't always work because fire doesn't necessarily behave like we think it's going to. So we're going to talk about that, and we'll hear about this from Mayor Jody Jones from the City of Paradise. We're going to learn more about then the downstream effects. So fires happen, say today, right now, for example, the Kincaid fire, which is I think only about 40% contained, and it's been burning for more than a week. Another example of what California is facing going forward. But it's what happens after that becomes another regional effect. So downstream, you'll learn from Gary Bardini, who's the Director of Planning at Safeca, about how they're using forest management in their efforts to work on flood control and strategies for that. And then, of course, what prompted this board to ask staff to work more on forest management was air quality. Again, another long-term downstream effect from these wildfires. Today we have Alberto Ayala from the Sacramento Metro Air Quality Management District to talk about their response in the Camp Fire, as well as what they're doing today to prepare our communities for these events in the future. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mayor Jody Jones. Many of you, or some of you, know her from her days here on the SACOG board. She was Caltrans District 3 Director, and so sat at the table with you to talk about these regional issues. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jody.
Thank you very much for having me here. Having gone through this, it's on my heart to help other jurisdictions with emergency preparedness, evacuation planning, so that you can avoid what my community's gone through. I thought I'd start with just some basic information on Paradise. It was a very slow growth area. We issued 20 to 30 building permits a year prior to the fire. Not much has changed in the last 20 years. Most of the homes and the buildings were built in the 50s and 60s. We were a financially poor town. 50% of our budget came from property taxes before the fire burned all the property down. And we had about a $12 million annual budget. This is a map of Paradise, and you can see that there are canyons on either side of the town. On the west is Butte Creek Canyon, and on the east is the Feather River Canyon. Up, I don't have a pointer, but way above the north end of that map about 8 miles is Polga, where the fire last year started. So in 2008, 2 fires threatened Paradise, and together they burned about 23,000 acres and 120 homes. Neither fire came into town. There was one on the West Canyon and one on the east. The one on the East Canyon started in Polga, same place as last year, about 8 miles away. It took 2 to 3 days to reach the river at the bottom of the canyon on the east side of Paradise. The fire officials stopped it at the river. They fought it for about a week. We evacuated. We had a terrible traffic jam during the evacuation. Our residents were able to come home, but we started planning on how we could improve for future evacuations. We did a lot of things. We divided the town into 14 zones and we set up assembly points. We developed preparedness information and evacuation maps and contraflow plans. We disseminated those plans to our residents, and that was the item that was passed out to you. That went by mail to every house in Paradise twice a year. We instituted Code Red, which is a reverse 911 system. It was automatic for landlines, but if you had a cell phone, you had to register it, or it wasn't tied to the system. You had to go online. We also worked with the county to get a Forest Service grant to pave one of our major roads, Skyway, north through Butte Meadows to give another evacuation route off the ridge. We developed an emergency operations plan. We held emergency operations center drills about every 6 months. We developed plans for contraflow evacuation because our roads are mainly rural 2-lane roads. We need to be able to get more people out of town. So if you take all the lanes and you make them go in one direction during an evacuation, you can accommodate more people. PG&E donated a trailer and all of the road signs necessary to implement, and we practiced this plan during a morning commute in 2016, and we tweaked it based on our residents' reactions. We had a number of small fires in the meantime where we implemented these plans, and they worked well. The most recent was in 2017 when a small fire came up Butte Creek Canyon, and we evacuated zones 4 and 9, and we opened the assembly point at the CMA church, and it was all very orderly. Residents were evacuated for about 6 hours until firefighters got the fire under control. As good as all of that planning was, it was overwhelmed by the events of November 8th. The fire, which again started in Polga 8 miles away, took only an hour and a half to reach Paradise. The winds were clocked at the high school at 79 miles an hour that day. The wind flung softball-sized embers 1 to 2 miles ahead of the fire front, and by 10:30 a.m. there was fire all over Paradise. Our zone system broke down by 8:30, and a town-wide evacuation ensued, which totally overwhelmed the transportation system. By 9:30 a.m., our cell towers were burning, and we lost all communication. Our emergency operations center evacuated about 11:30 a.m., and by 2:30, most of the town was destroyed. Oops, sorry. So these are our evacuation routes. There's 6 ways off the ridge, which is way more than lots of our rural communities have. To the south, there's Pence, Clark, Neal, Skyway, and Honey Run. And to the north through Magalia, that's the top X, that road continues north. You can get through Butte Meadows and out. The X's show where each of these roads were blocked sometime during that day. Pence and Clark were each closed for a good period of time during the morning hours because they were overrun by fire. People couldn't get through. And Honey Run was as well later in the day. Skyway and Neal were closed due to trees or power poles falling 2 or 3 different times in the afternoon, and then the First responders would get the trees or the power poles out. The poles were burning and then falling into the roads. They were cleared and reopened. The northern route through Magalia was open most of the day, but then closed about 5 o'clock that afternoon due to fire as well. So this map overlays the evacuation routes with the fire. So you can see why it was a problem. The normal 20-minute trip to Chico took most people evacuating 4 hours. And they had fire all around them as they were crawling out of town. People who couldn't escape were sheltered in place by firefighters at 6 or 7 locations in town, and all of them were saved, thankfully. Although you can get to Highway 70 and Oroville and point south from most of these roads, the yellow arrows show you that most of the traffic evacuating from Paradise wanted to go to Chico, and so they all tried to go that way. All of those routes went through the intersection in the red circle, which was not part of any of our evacuation planning in Paradise. This circle's in Chico. The traffic backed up all the way into Paradise where the fire was, which contributed to that 4-hour time frame to get out. This points to the need to coordinate evacuation planning with neighboring jurisdictions. You can't just look at your own transportation network. Some of our people who lived along Edgewood waited too long to leave and were caught by the fire and unable to escape. This map, 14,000 structures were destroyed in this fire. And this map, every red dot on it is our destroyed structure, burnt to the ground. That's 90% of our residential stock and 50% of our commercial space. We had 1,400 homes survive. Now, we didn't have a lot of buildings built after 2008. The state of California adopted the Wildland Urban Interface Standards for high fire severity zones in 2008. We issued maybe 20 or 30 building permits a year, so we didn't have a lot of stock built after 2008. But what we did have, 51% survived. Of those structures built prior to 2008, 9% survived. So one of the things, we practiced a lot for the disaster. We knew absolutely nothing about what you do after a disaster. What is recovery planning, and what is required, and what do you do? Nobody practices that. So we've been learning a lot. There's such a thing called the long-term recovery plan that's required by the federal government when you have a disaster like this, and you have to do one before you can qualify for all the federal disaster money. No other community that's been a declared federal disaster has ever done one in their first year. We completed our plan at the 7-month mark. We had a grant from the Butte Strong Fund, which allowed us to hire a consultant with a lot of experience in disaster recovery, and we had huge community input with many public meetings where we had 1,000 folks show up. So we got our plan done. It contains all the projects we need to do in order to rebuild our town. Some of those transportation projects include evacuation routes, so we're looking at addressing our choke points, making improvements to roadway widths, eliminating ditches, adding direction and wayfinding signs, undergrounding utilities, which gives us more room. PG&E is committed to underground all of the utilities in Paradise, and those utility poles mostly go along our evacuation routes, so we'll have some more room that we can use. We have missing roadway segments and long dead-end streets. These are all being combined into one project where we will be hiring a consultant who will give us recommendations on what we should be doing. Our plan also called for building code standards. Now, everything that's going to be rebuilt in Paradise is going to be built to those wildland-urban interface standards, or WUI standards, that I mentioned. But our council went above and beyond based on our community's input. We were really walking a fine line between affordability, people being able to afford to rebuild in town, and what additional things we could require to make our community more fire resistant. We chose to go with the things that our fire officials said make the most difference, and they're actually things that don't cost a lot of money. We banned railroad ties. We imposed a 5-foot setback around all homes. So for anything that is flammable material, for instance, you cannot connect a wood fence to a house in Paradise anymore. You have to have a 5-foot gap. You can have a metal gate, but you can't connect your wood fence to your house. You can't connect a wood deck to your house. You have to have 5 feet around your house for anything flammable. That was the thing that they said would make the most difference. We require non-combustible gutters, which strangely is not part of WUI, but should be. Anything over 120 square feet has to be WUI compliant. But if you have a shed that's under 120 feet and it's not WUI compliant, it has to be set back 30 feet from your house. And we adopted a 100-foot defensible space ordinance. So when I was asked to come here, I was asked to also talk a little bit about some policy issues that perhaps all of you could help with that I see that need to be addressed. The first is fuel reduction on state and federal lands, which I think you've all been talking about already, forestry management. The campfire started 8 miles away in Polga, as I said. It was on federal lands that had burned in that fire in 2008, and then no maintenance of any kind was done, and those lands were allowed to be overrun with brush that was exceeded 20 feet tall and was so thick that the fire engines could not get to the origin of the fire. So I think that for Paradise, that at the state and federal level is one of our top priorities. We need more money to go to forest management, and we need a different kind of forest management. They need to be reducing those fuels on those federal and state lands. The second is how the state handles water restrictions. We'd been the whole state on water restrictions for what, 4 or 5 years prior to this fire because of the drought. Now, Paradise has its own water source, which was plentiful for our population. We didn't need water restrictions. We had enough water for our folks, and our water really can't go to anyone else. But because the state adopted an across-the-board water restriction, we were required to reduce our water, or our water district would be fined, just like all of yours. So our folks complied, and they weren't watering their yards. And so our town was tinder dry when this fire came, but it didn't need to be. There was water there that could have kept that landscape green and could have made a difference in the fire. And then the third one, which I think is on everyone's mind right now, is these PG&E public safety power outages. The people in Paradise have been without power. It came back on yesterday afternoon, but they had been without power because of PSPS for 14 of the last 30 days. These are the people living in Paradise now are the 1,400 homes that survived, and a good number of folks living in their RVs on their property while they're rebuilding. they've got a power pole and a hookup, but they're in a trailer and they're losing their power for 14 out of the last 30 days. The outages affect all of our traffic signals. We have battery backups, but they last 8 hours and then our signals go dark. We have a lot of workers in our town who aren't from there, and you can just sit at those intersections and people just blow right by them. It's so unsafe. Our residents have lost food supplies at least 3 times in the last month. We have folks with medical equipment needs just like all of you do, and business owners who just opened their businesses and now they're having to throw away product. So as a state, we need to figure out some way that all of us are not without power every fall for 50% of the time. It's ridiculous. And it's really affecting our ability to repopulate and rebuild paradise. So with that, I'd answer any questions you have.
I don't really have a question, but Jody, we served together for so long on this board, and your service in the whole region with so many of our jurisdictions. I know, as the situation was unfolding, just the heartbreak that I felt for you as the mayor, and obviously as a colleague and a friend, and then also the great pride to see your leadership in the community, and how fortunate that at least there wasn't the mayoral disaster that there had been on every other front, and to have somebody of your skill and capacity, attention to detail, vision, connection, network, and dealing with the impacts in your own life of the event itself, and leading was extraordinarily impressive. It was no surprise knowing you, but just want to express both sympathy but also incredible admiration for the leadership that you've shown both during and since the event.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, I'll leave you with some good news. There's a lot of progress going on in Paradise. While we used to issue 20 building permits a year, we're on track for 500 since about March. There are houses going up all over town. Almost all of the debris is gone from the ridge. Every single council person lost their home in the fire, and every single one stayed. I'm so proud of them. I'm proud of my community. They're a resilient bunch that consider themselves to be pioneers. And so we will come back, and thank you all for your support.
Thank you, Jody. Sue?
Mayor Jones, I had no idea that prior to this event that you and your colleagues had gone to such great lengths to prepare for something like that, and I'm really grateful that you came here to share this with us. I wanted to ask you, I think it's wonderful that you're compelled to share your story, because I think you can help people. And I know in my district, the city of Folsom, their fire chief is working on an emergency preparedness plan as we speak, and Rancho Murrieta is also very concerned about their water and the way they're situated. And I wonder if you're in communication with, is there a way that we can connect you and your story with others? Because I think as they're working their way through their plans, it might make them think there were things that you described that I wouldn't even have anticipated in my mind. So you have some really valuable experience that might help some of us that have some rural areas that are exposed. Is it possible to get your card?
Sure, I would be happy to. And we've been trying to share our story with the League of Cities, and I've given this similar presentation to a group of State Transportation Commission officials. although our plans didn't exactly work, if we hadn't had them, I think a lot more people would have died. Our folks knew what to do in an evacuation, even if it didn't go as smoothly as we wanted it to. And I would highly encourage every jurisdiction to have some kind of an evacuation plan and to practice it with your citizens. It's really important.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Yeah, I also want to thank the mayor and the city. You hosted a delegation from the League of California Cities that had been planned in advance of the fire. Fire then occurred, and we thought, oh, we need to cancel that. And you guys actually said, no, come anyway. And it was sort of at the peak of cleanup, I think.
Yes, it was in May.
Yeah, and that was an extraordinarily eye-opening experience for those of us who were able to attend. But I want to thank you for it because that had reverberations throughout the league in terms of contact with, so up close and personal with something. And your words that you've shared with us today are very similar to what you shared with us that day. And so I just commend all my colleagues, the great work they've been doing, not only on their own behalf, but on behalf of all of us, really. Alex?
I was just going to comment that the two things that you pointed out, I think, are extraordinarily important in Folsom and for a lot of us. And part of what Chief Rodriguez is working on is incorporating into our plans, not just evacuation for Folsom, but how to clear the roads in Folsom so that other people can evacuate through. Because we are a bottleneck, just the way that Chico was in your instance, or could be. So that's part of what our plan will incorporate. So I would encourage everyone to do that. And then the second thing is we have we have the Lake Natomas, American River passing through Folsom, and those lands are controlled by state parks and the Bureau of Reclamation, and they are a terrible partner when it comes to fire protection. So to the extent that all of us can influence state policy in any way, friendly creation of defensible space should be something we should encourage, because the city of Folsom would be happy to go in and delimb a lot of trees that are immediately adjacent to our city hall and our fire station and all along through the town. But we are prohibited from doing so. Thank you very much.
Alex?
Jody, again, I'd like to thank you for your presentation today and back in May for the SACOG division meeting. But I'd also like to mention, I know here in COG and there's boundaries, lines we have, but really in situations like this, there is no boundary lines. And the reason why I mention this is that because with Live Oak, we got hit with a lot of the evacuees, and it's great that you're working with nearby cities, but I would like to include Sutter County in our cities and even Yuba County involved in any work we can do. We have with the evacuations, because the same thing similar happened with you guys. I know people, residents in Live Oak, that moved north with for the evacuation in 2016 with Lake Oroville, something like. And we were spread out everywhere, and I know people that sent up their RVs up to Paradise, and unfortunately we never want to have anything like this ever happen again to any of our cities, but just the dialogue, and whether with SACOG and with BCAG as well. This is a topic, an issue, and I'm sure there's more that we can work on together.
Absolutely.
And again, I appreciate it again, and I welcome everybody to visit Paradise again and just see how it looks now and the progress, and it's amazing. It really is amazing.
It is. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Very much.
To the chair.
Oh.
Forget to look to this side.
Sure.
Yeah,
sorry, it's the glare from the light.
Yeah, it's the bright aura of our personality. I wanted to thank you, Mayor, and not only touch on what Alex brought up. One day, we may be all we have, and we can't let boundaries, or we can't let, well, you're a part of that, because I'll tell you what, when at 11:30, when your OES left, we found out about it. We sent ours. We were there. Yuba County was there for you, and it didn't matter if they were a different county or not. That's based on our experience going through so many devastating fires prior to this, flood evacuations. We stood up a really strong evacuation center. I got to actually stand up an evacuation center for the people of Paradise, and we do that without even considering anything else but the humanity of helping our neighbor. And this is the example that we do because that's what's right. It has nothing to do with over here, over there, not in my backyard. We know what our people went through when they went through it, and we don't ever want to have any other people go through it that way either. So we stand ready to help you and assist you in any ways possible. And the federal administration, actually the White House, is actually committed to help contribute to Evacuation Routes funding. Okay, just keep that in your put that in your hat, and then that way you can get the funding you need to get the evacuation routes. They'd like to see more local control, just like SACOG, and that's local in boots on the ground. So thank you very much. All my heart goes out in empathy, and we stand ready to help. Thank you.
Matt?
Thank you, Chair. My little city has very similar topographic features that you have in Paradise, Mayor. I guess the question I had for you is fuel reductions, shaded fuel breaks are a constant battle up in the city of Auburn where I'm from. And I know that some of our folks have been reaching out and working with folks from Paradise to help us better understand how we can better be prepared. We're fighting with BLM to get permission to get onto their property to expand a fuel break from a few hundred feet to 600 or 700 feet. What kind of success have you had in these recent months with your advocacy for fuel reduction work? And is there anything that other jurisdictions like mine can do to support what you guys are trying to do? Because we're all affected by it.
It's really hard. Our Fire Safe Council's been very active. Actually had a fuel break project that was implemented prior to the fire that we believe was instrumental in saving the community of Magalia. But that took years, and one of the issues, the biggest issue that the Fire Safe Council tells me that they have in doing these projects is CEQA, because they have to go to each individual landowner to get permission to do the fuel break. And then once they get those landowners, they do a CEQA document, has to go through the whole process. And then if one other landowner says, oh, we'd like to join now that we see what you're doing, then they have to go back and do CEQA all over again. It's a very long, drawn-out process. There has to be a way to make it more streamlined for this purpose. I mean, they're not clear-cutting. They're just reducing ground fuels, thinning trees, that sort of thing. But in terms of the federal agencies, it's a battle, even though they will tell you they are for it when you go meet with the folks in Washington, D.C., but trying to make it happen on the ground is very hard.
That's exactly what we're experiencing as well. Thank you for being here today.
All right, David, I think we have a couple more speakers this morning.
We do, and I'm not sure if Supervisor Veerkamp would like to come to the podium or speak from his chair, but.
I prefer the mat cleanup, if you don't mind, David.
Okay.
There's a couple things that I'm going to do will help tie everything together.
Okay.
And address some of the other questions that have been brought up.
Okay, great. Well, then to keep on this theme that, forest fires and wildfires and preparedness is not just an upland issue, we're going to have Gary Bardini come up and talk about what the flood control agency here in Sacramento County is working on and how it links all the way back up to the top of the ridge.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Gary Bardini, Director of Planning for the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency. What I have in front of you are three kind of items to discuss. One, a little bit about climate resiliency and the efforts working with the resiliency executive order that the Governor Gavin Newsom has put out, and then we're looking for further NITS participation in improving resiliency, and then talk a little bit more about regionally what we're doing in Sacramento. This graphic I have in front of you is is one that reflects what we call the condition of atmospheric rivers. So in the case here in California, we have a thing that some people call it the Pineapple Express. What it really amounted to is you have a big volume of water that's in your cloud structure, and when you have these phenomena, this happens to be a graphic that was done by Scripps, and this kind of reflects just the different events that came in and created one of the wettest years on record. But, you know, any number of these with the right combination creates a condition in Sacramento that's fairly perilous. We have a very steep mountain range, a lot of you in the headlands, and then of course it makes its way to the community very rapidly. So there's quite a bit of infrastructure in Sacramento we have to treat this phenomenon. This graphic here, resiliency, I put this one, this is an academic definition, but it's very important. In fact, with the previous speaker about the realities of resiliency, it's not enough to build strong or make your system more redundant. There's the aspects of how quick can you respond, the resourcefulness of your community, how quick, evacuations, all the things we described about, and then the ability to, what they call rapidity or recovery. It's all of those elements of both structural and non-structural are needed to provide a more climate resilient environment for our population. To the flood part, I got a graphic here that reflects essentially where we're at in Sacramento. Sacramento, as you all know, is one of the lowest protected communities in flood in the country. Right now, we have a significant effort and have been over the last 20 years. We've put $2 billion of improvements into this region, about $1 billion in Folsom Dam with the new outlet structures. But we actually are doing about $2 billion of additional work over the next 5 to 10 years with the Corps of Engineers. We think by the time we complete that in that yellow box, we'll be up about 300 year protection. But with climate and with the conditions I described, SAFCA has been pursuing much more aggressive regional projects beyond that, and I'll talk about them, to get up to 500 year, which we think is needed to the resiliency and to be in parity with a lot of other major cities in the country. We already saw this by David's graphic. This is just, again, where some of the depths are if we have a break on our levee systems downstream. Some of these will be as much as 30 feet deep, and some of these will be in very cold waters during a period, so the loss of life would be significant if we were to have an event. Even in New Orleans, yeah, it's very quick. So this is a reflection of some of the work we've done in the green. These are the efforts downstream we've done and at the dam that have been completed. The ones that are in other colors is just a reflection of some of the other improvements that we're making right now over the next 5 to 10 years. This graphic, though, is one that kind of reflects, while I've described a little of the efforts in the gold, which we call the core-led projects. We're looking at new projects. One of them we're going to talk a little bit more is what I call a Sacramento area flood reduction managed aquifer recharge project, which is to help with the headwaters and a little bit of our focus. And then, of course, working at the Yolo bypass, which is making the system more redundant and increasing the capacity downstream. We feel by these management actions, we should be able to achieve over 500 year protection for the city. So with that, I was going to talk about the realities of doing an upstream project. This happens to be some of the 13 key items that the Department of Water Resources identified when formulating a project, which they call a flood management aquifer recharge. Talks about the headwaters and how you do hydrologic observation upstream, all the way down to essentially the significant federal, state, and local policy and legal constraints that you have to do to bring that together. We just heard about some of these just in managing forest practices. This is a better visual that I reflect about trying to put this project together. SAFCA, working with a lot of local agencies, the federal and state, are now looking at the institutional management on the extreme of these events for both flood, and then how can we leverage to deal with too little water, and how do we provide more resiliency and water supply in the community by making these investments. And then working with the Bureau, particularly in the American watershed, how we would work the operations to facilitate that. So these are some of the efforts that SAFCA is embarking on right now. So this visual is a new visual we've just kind of produced, which kind of reflects how we bring all these pieces together. Today we're talking more specific about the upstream reservoir efforts and modifications of upstream reservoirs and working on the headwaters. And that would be in the yellow of your graphic. It's a little bit hard to see here. But what we're doing here is the way we bring forecasting and then integrating that with the upstream reservoirs down to Folsom will allow us to operate more efficiently and get additional flood control capacity by doing this. The green reflects in the dots there are all the management actions around Folsom, and then of course the downstream efforts that we have. And then we'd like to work and continue to work with the South County on how to take advantage of groundwater banking opportunities that we have more efficient operations upstream. And the idea here is that we have additional storage upstream, which is by improving their outlet structure. So similar to what we did at Folsom, we can integrate that in, and with that storage, along with the current improvements, we'll be able to provide a lot more flood control in the region. Okay. More specific, I did this graphic. We just finished the joint federal project at Folsom. Most folks have seen it. We have operated it in tests, and it was used just this year, in terms of releases. That system basically works on forecasts. It's actually the water control manual takes in what we call 5-day forecast. And I just wanted to give you just an indication of how this operation works current. And we would be embellishing or working further on that when we do the water control manual again in 2024, when we complete a 3.5-foot raise at Folsom. But essentially what it does, it takes a forecast at 5 days out. If you get a forecast where you exceed a volume of 300,000 acre feet, then it releases 25,000 CFS. And then 3 days out, if you got an event, then it's going to go 50, and it ramps its way up. So we use forecast. And what's very important is that the National Weather Service provides us this forecast, and if we do have a burn or something in the headwaters, that forecasting is updated in the watershed and the models, and that is reflected as inherently embedded in our operation. But again, it's very important in forest practices, so if we do have fires upstream, you're going to have the water. It's going to come right down the reservoir much quicker, and it's going to be an impact on our forecast. This is just a last slide that I have. I won't really go over in detail, but it just reflects that what we're trying to do with the now what we call our FloodMar project is then start adding the reservoirs upstream, working both with Placer County Water and with SMUD. Both are basically partnering with us to look at making modifications to their outlet structures that would facilitate additional storage during that forecast. And with that, we would have a 7-day forecasting would be integrated into our current 5-day forecasting at Folsom. So that's a bit of what we're doing in the region here. And I think we're going to have a panel, so take questions.
Yeah, we'll take questions at the end.
Great.
We're going to switch gears and talk again about the other regional impact that we have on the table today, which is the impacts on our air quality. And Alberto will be talking to you about both the past response from the campfire and then what they're doing today, looking forward.
Thank you. Good morning, and board. Good to be here. Thank you for having us. Again, Alberto Ayala, I'm the Air Pollution Control Officer with the Sacramento Metro Air Quality Management District. I want to acknowledge my colleague, Janice Lam Snyder, who's in charge of our air monitoring activities. So we have a new state mandate in response to the campfire specifically, and it's calling for our agency to lead a coordination effort to be better prepared when we have to respond to the next smoke event that will hit the region. But just to kind of put things in perspective, obviously, as an air quality agency, the thing that we're trying to reach is attainment of the national ambient air quality standards. And when you have a fire like the campfire, obviously that is going to put pressure on us even getting close. And I include this graphic here just to kind of give you a sense in terms of how significant the air pollution can be when you have to deal with a fire like the campfire was. I hope that most of you are familiar with the Air Quality Index. It actually relates directly to the legally binding air quality standards that we're trying to meet. And the number I want to draw your attention to is the 35 microgram per cubic meter ambient standard for particulate matter in ambient air. And the reason that is relevant is because if you see the graphic that I show here, at the peak of the pollution impact from the campfire last November here in the region, we were almost out of range. We almost hit the peak of the air quality index, which is both 500 in terms of the index and actually 500 micrograms per cubic meter. That is obviously order of magnitude higher than the ambient air quality standards, and obviously the ambient air quality standards are based on what is needed to protect public health. So the issue is clear here, and you can see the transient nature of the event where we hit one day, it sort of the concentrations in ambient air decrease, and then we got hit again. So it's very relevant, to say the least, that we're going to have to be prepared, because we are expecting, given our changing climate, that this is going to be more of the so-called the new normal. And the other thing that I'll point out as well is that on any given event, we may not necessarily just be talking about natural emissions from natural products. And unfortunately, Paradise was a great example where not only did we have the natural environment burning, but obviously industrial materials, cars, everything that is in a home, et cetera. So that creates an elevated level of concern to folks like us. And there's a lot of research going on at the moment trying to understand exactly what the impact from those new emission sources are going to be. You don't need a campfire to get into a situation where public health is going to be threatened, because earlier in the year, unfortunately, we had the car fire. Obviously, the magnitude was very different. And I show, again, just some numbers from that fire where, again, you can see that you can very easily, given these events, exceed the ambient air quality levels. And that is what prompts people like us, in partnership with folks like SACOG and others, to take action. So in response to the Camp Fire, I want to acknowledge Councilmember Steve Hansen, who led an effort at the Capitol, and Assemblymember McCarty had a bill that was one of 22 that the governor signed related to wildfire response, recovery, preparedness, et cetera. And this particular one is a requirement that applies to our air district. And putting it simply, it's essentially a direction for us to coordinate regionally and prepare a response plan so that we are in front of the issue when the next big fire hits us. We're taking the lessons from the Camp Fire, and I think many of us will acknowledge that there are many things that we wish would have worked better in terms of just getting the message out, coordinating. Schools was a big issue, schools wanting to get direction from folks like us in terms of do we close, do we not close, just getting the word out, et cetera. So what this Assembly Bill 661 is essentially mandating us to do is to bring the folks to the table. And I am big on one fact, and that is we're not reinventing the wheel. A lot of this is already out there. The way I think about 661 is really packaging it in something that makes sense and is reasonable for us. We're going to be working with the county health officer, obviously, emergency services, and like I said, the school districts are friends at ARB and others, including SACOG and Sacramento RT, SMART, and other agencies in the region. What's in the plan? What's in the mandate? Obviously, recommendations. What do you do when you're almost out of air quality index colors and the concentrations are peaking? What do we do then? What is the message? I'm sorry? Correct. Right. We need to be clear in terms of who does what. I think many of us across the agency were getting calls from people just wanting some direction. We want to be better at letting people know who to call, when to call, et cetera. Businesses, best practices for not only public agencies, but also businesses. And one of the key issues we had to deal with was air pollution outside obviously was very bad, but in many cases, indoor air pollution was also bad. So we were getting calls from people saying, we can smell the fire inside. What do? Do we send people home? What is the right strategy? So we want to get into some of those issues in front of them before they happen. Again, and of course, we have, unfortunately, many people that actually live on the streets, and what do we do with sensitive populations and folks like that? So the plan is essentially pretty comprehensive. I won't go into many areas of detail here. I'll point out a couple of the elements that are going to be controversial. We know that some of these issues are going to take some difficult discussions. I just pointed to outdoor versus indoor pollution levels. There's a reason we don't have standards for indoor air pollution. And one of them is, how do you define that? But clearly that became an issue that we were getting calls on. Our own office, being an air agency, we have the instrumentation and the means to, turn on a sensor inside and be able to tell our own staff when it's time to perhaps go home or find an alternative location. But not everybody has those means. We need to explore those options. The other issue is clean air centers. The city of Sacramento, thankfully, is proactively pushing forward on those plans. But, we got a lot of calls from the schools saying, wouldn't it be nice if we actually had a cleaner center in our school so that if the kids are here, at least there is one place to go to. And, one of the roles that we want to play is basically connecting the dots. there's, for a number of good reasons, we have some clean air programs where some of the state cap and trade funding is available, and we can target it for schools. In general, there's going to be efforts to improve air quality at schools, and if we can do that and also be thinking about the next fire response, those are some of the dots that we want to connect with this particular plan. And like I said, notification for businesses is huge. Obviously, the state is taking action. The issue of the mask is front and center. The public health officer understands that. We understand that. We want to get in, have those discussions now before we have to respond again. And as you can imagine, the plan is going to take some time. It's essentially slated to be about a year effort of discussion, planning, analysis, determination of if we are going to have a pool of sensors, for example, that agencies and businesses and public entities can essentially tap into. What does that program look like? So we got to work through all those details. Basically, we're hoping to have something for our Air District Board by the beginning of 2021, and we are being asked to report back to the legislature by 1/1/2022. And the idea here, again, is that to the extent that we can figure things out that can work for a region, a community like ours, there's going to be wide interest in this. And obviously, we're working with many of our fellow air districts on these efforts. Because again, we are very adamant about not reinventing the wheel. A lot of this has already been done. There's been a lot of good thought and effort already invested in this. So this is really just putting something together that makes sense for us. So with that, I'll stop there.
I think the speaker needs no introduction.
Well, I may get kicked out of here before I'm done, but I'm just kidding.
I think his tie needs an introduction, though.
Ty does? Yeah, well, it's fitting, man. My wife takes good care of me. First and foremost, I want to thank all of those that have helped El Dorado County in this last week and a half, and we've got another hard week to go with the loss of our deputy sheriff, and the memorial service will be held in Placer County next Tuesday, and all of the things that will transpire as we put that local community hero to rest. So thanks for all that support, and it's not over yet. And remember, too, we're always there for you guys as well. So I want to make sure that that gets passed on. It's quite a time for us to deal with. It's a great pleasure today to help out with this panel. David, thank you, as well as the tour that we did in El Dorado County. El Dorado County is place that's been exempt from catastrophic wildfire. Luckily for us, most of it's been in the forest areas, and it hasn't got started or taken that turn that such as Paradise had. But we set up remarkably similar to the area there in Paradise. I spent 32 years of my life and career in emergency services, 10 of those traveling the state of California as well as into Nevada and Idaho, working on incident management teams dealing with catastrophic events, mostly fire, wildland fire, but other ones as well, whether they were earthquakes, floods. California's obviously the fruits, nuts, and flakes for every emergency you can think of. And I was, I guess, blessed with that opportunity to be part of those responses and observe firsthand, and in my role as a liaison officer, work with most public officials in what was going on, what maybe could have been done better, reading after action reports and assimilating information. And that's been a real passion of mine, and I still do it to this day, let alone being an elected public official, and then trying to apply that now in a very complicated manner, which all of you understand very well. I got the opportunity this spring to testify before a congressional panel on this very topic, and it was quite an interesting issue, obviously. And one of the things that I brought up was the 2009 Flame Act. It is an act enacted by Congress in 2009 that mandated a cohesive strategy amongst responders and governments to deal with the things that we're dealing with now today in 2019. And half that panel that was there had blank stares on their face when I mentioned the 2009 Flame Act. The ones that knew it understood it because they knew it came with really zero funding. So yes, it was one of the more of those things that we enacted and then didn't fund. Thus, the reasons why the Forest Service and BLM and others had basically just a senseless piece of paper that they were told to do something and yet had no way to carry it out. So at that time, I challenged that group to go back to their home areas and see if they knew of the cohesive strategy, what had they done about it? And I would challenge this group as well to do the same thing, because it's through those partnerships that you will get more done than you will with anything coming out of, unfortunately, the government, because we are the ones at the lowest level that can get it done. Our cohesive strategy in El Dorado County has been up and running now for probably going to say about 4 years. Forest Service driven, but really the locals are doing the work. We have gotten more monies and more grants and more work done by nonprofits than any federal or state funding whatsoever. All we seem to get, especially from the state, are more regulatory requirements that are inconsistent with what we're attempting to do. And somehow we got to turn that around. And that's why the advocacy and so forth that we're doing with Jennifer Montgomery and the Forest Health Task Force and other people now that have been put into place, I think we'll start to chisel some of that away. But from us and what we can accomplish and we need to accomplish, there are things that are there that are in law now that we don't follow up on. And I'm gonna poke a finger right at CAL FIRE in 4291. It is a state requirement that these minimum clearances, that are not as much as probably, Jody, what you have now or what El Dorado County has now enacted, but they are minimum requirements. And the first one being is you have to have clean roofs and clean gutters. You get in a catastrophic wildfire with a wind blowing, you're going to get 1 mile ember spread. You're seeing it all over Southern California now, and no fun at Southern California, but you know, the Bel Air fire and some of those fires back in the 60s were clear indications of what is happening now, and they're going to continue to happen because the wind blows astronomically in Southern California. And so Bel Air fire was a roof-to-roof obliteration of a subdivision from too much vegetation and obviously roofing materials that aided and spread that fire and wiped out the whole subdivision. So we have learned some lessons from those sorts of things, but yet today it still continues. And when you look at the vegetation fuel loading, not only there, but in our areas as well, it's way overboard. So that's one area that we've got to work on. So 4291 already's there, but who wants to enforce it? Nobody. It's no fun. It's work. It's prevention. It's not sexy. What's sexy? All the neat stuff on TV today. You see all the catastrophic fire brands and the whirlwind and the helicopter drops and the airplane drops. Yeah. At hundreds of $1,000s an hour. We need to get out ahead of it. And the preventive work is much cheaper than the suppression work. Proven time and time again. The air quality issues, as you alluded to as well, are much less by doing preventative work than they are of these catastrophic fires. Proven time and time again. So work your cohesive strategy. Find out, if you don't know about it, what it is and why your area is not doing it. We've got 40 entities involved, and they are cooperating to get things done. Believe me, it's a slow process. I'm a get it done tomorrow type guy, but it's a slow process, but we've got to start somewhere. Again, we've got to work on a state regulation. They've got to also understand, and I think now there's starting to be some headway there, that some of the things that they mandate aren't working, and they're inconsistent with what we're attempting to do. And yeah, just as I spoke earlier about the housing piece, how do you put more houses in an area that is a recipe for disaster? So there's got to be some common sense there. Jody, you mentioned it as well, water. I truly believe I'm a fifth generation El Dorado County resident, the drying up and browning of our county, region, state of our conservation, when we're getting more water from the sky, and why we're not storing it and keeping places lush and green, is a major contributing factor to this. And all you have to look to is just look around, especially in the rural regions, and they're brown. They're not green. The golf courses are dead. The green belts are dead because we got to conserve everything. How can you conserve everything when you add population? You've got to add something. So anyway, more stuff to be worked on there, and that's the state water issue. And there's just some things that have to be done. Master stewardship agreements. We're working on a county-wide one. There's actually talk of a regional one. This is where we can get in and get the work done on Forest Service land, BLM land, and where they can't seem to get it done. I too talked to the folks at Washington. They're all in, but when you talk to the locals, don't have any money, can't make it happen. You know, it's the same dilemma. So there's ways around it, and they're very open to these master stewardship agreements, and that's where, again, we can do the work, and we can use then nonprofit monies to do that. Utility clearances, this one, you know, this whole power thing to me is unbelievable, because for years, as I worked in the fire service with PG&E, we requested them to just please clear your utility easements. And I don't mean the 4-inch or the 4-foot trimming or now the 10-foot trimming. You make totem poles and you make ugly looking brush or trees out of it. Take it off at the ground. It's an easement. That's what it's for. And we have the same issue with our county easements. We have old prescriptive easements that say whatever necessary for the roadway of Mosquito Road. And yet we're afraid to tell a landowner that tree that's right on the edge of Mosquito Road is either A, combustible, or B, a sight distance issue. Because nobody wants to take anybody on. Well, I'm sorry, those what easements are for. So we have to be able to stand up. SMUD 4 years ago started their big transmission line power clearing through El Dorado County from the Upper American River Project, finishing in El Dorado Hills this year. And obviously people would call and complain to my office about, they're gonna take my trees out. They're not your trees. They're God's trees. And I learned a long time ago, if we don't manage the land, it will manage us. And you won't have a tree left. Jody, am I right?
You're right.
So, got to take a stance. I know sometimes it's political, or it seems to be political, but what's the right thing to do? And sometimes you got to just, hey, sorry. And some of these people that I had this conversation with were firefighters. That was the scary part. We don't want them on our property, and we don't want those trees touched. Sorry, I'm not coming to your defense. I'm telling SMUD to get the work done. So we have to take some tough stances and have to be able to do that. And utility clearances, that's a no-brainer. Those are easements that we can clean up as well as our roadways. Fuel reduction, state and federal lands, I think we talked about. Water as well. So given the catastrophic wildfire of Paradise, but even before that, El Dorado County was working on a mandatory vegetation management program. I don't think government does a good job fixing anything, but when it comes to public safety and when it comes to this catastrophic wildfire that we continue to have, I think we got to step in and create a public safety element. And that's obviously part of your general plan and part of all your planning documents. So last year we undertook, it was 2 years ago, the process of developing a mandatory vegetation management plan. We already had one called a vacant lot ordinance in El Dorado Hills, which is where I worked as a fire assistant chief in chief. Cameron Park had initiated one. And so it really, again, and it's all modeled after 4291, but you can obviously make it more strict, which is what we did. You're able to then put the onerness, which it needs to start there anyway, with the homeowner. There's certain things they need to be accountable and responsible for. You build that into your ordinance, and then your ordinance also has a provision for action. A lot of things that we do don't have that action element. This one does. We'll have contractors on staff or on contract. They will go out and do the work after a couple of inspections and when that third inspection hits. I don't know, Wendy, if you read the paper the other day, but there was actually a respondent that got his tax bill notice, and in the tax bill saying this ordinance now is taking effect. He asked if we were in bed with the insurance companies. You know what? take a risk living in God's country, you at least better be responsible and take care of what you have to protect not only yourself, but how about your neighbor? And then we talk then about evacuation routes as well. I've hounded, and this was post Jody, Caltrans. Highway 50 closes at the blink of an eye because the vegetation along it is so dense. How are we going to use it as an evacuation route? It's one of our major thoroughfares east and west. So we're still haggling over in the easement where they've got the right to do it, cleaning up some of these areas. And I'm going to continue to haggle on them till I guess I'm probably in my grave, because those are, again, easements that are the no-brainer. Those are the places that shouldn't even be a discussion. So wherever you have those, build the partnerships, work in collaboration, and get the cooperation. You know, I know the whole environmental thing has been to protect everything, but again, we've taken it way too far. And you look at the King Fire today, 5 years, 6 years, and we were up there, there's not an amphibian in those watersheds today, 5, 6 years later, that was there then. So we talk about yellow-legged frogs, red-legged frogs, and on and on. Nothing. Nuked them. And the soil continues just to run down and cause watershed issues every year when we get the rains. So there's a lot of common sense that could be applied. We have to just be smart enough and strong enough to say, wait a minute, time out. I learned a long time ago from a lecturer that was really heavily into risk management, and he stated, and I believe it, if it's preventable, if it's predictable, it's preventable. We know, we've learned enough, but we fail just to look back at history and then take action based on that history. We always want to create the new because it's sexy and it's fun and so forth. We've got to learn from things and then apply it. And that's the hard work. But that's what people have to get done. So with that, I think we've got some questions. And David, anybody?
All right, Brian, thank you for that. Very good comments, all of our speakers. David, is there anything you want to close with?
No, if there's questions, I know we're running late, but want to make sure that if there's any questions out there that we can try to answer them. Otherwise, if not, this is, again, you know, our effort to show you that forest management, that forest health, that wildfire and wildfire preparedness is, again, it's not just an upland issue. This is a regional issue, and I hope you were able to gather that today from our speakers. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for joining us today, and thank you for your attention to this matter. It's critically important, and just another example of why I think SACOG is so well positioned to have these kinds of conversations, to bring this into the regional dialogue, and to be effective in going forward in our future to handle these challenges. And with that, thank you.
Well, thank you, David. You have made a number of unique and important contributions to SACOG during your time here. I think this might be the last time you're with us. I'm not sure.
This is my last day.
You're literally your last day.
It is my last day.
So through the chair. Well, I would like to turn the mic here over to Director Saylor, who's got a few words for you on behalf of the board.
I'm just so delighted to be able, on behalf of the board and on behalf of the people of Yolo County, to thank David Shabazian for his insight, his deep dedication to our region, and his added value at every opportunity. And I know that he's going to go now to a place where they're going to start calling him the boss. So David, congratulations, and here you'll find some treats from Yolo County, a gift to you, and I hope this relationship continues for many years to come. Congratulations.
Now, Don, I assume we've checked those out with the state gift requirements.
I'm not on duty yet.
Oh, that's true. It doesn't apply yet. We're good. All right. Let's see. We are going to move on to reports. It says I'm supposed to give a report. My report is there's going to be a lunch in this room. You should stay for it. It's going to be great. We had a great event yesterday. Thank you to staff for the Futures Forum. All board members who were there, thank you for being there. We had a great turnout, great event all the way around. Any other board member have a transportation-related report to do? Seeing none, I'm looking at the executive director. Darren, you have a transportation-related report.
Not transportation, go ahead.
James, you have anything you want to close us with?
Just a quick few reminders. We mentioned the special board meeting November 18th. If you haven't already, it's critical you let Lynette here know exactly where you will be. Either you hopefully will be here, but we are doing telephonic call into that board, but we need that to be noticed. We need to be accessible, and so we need to know ASAP. There is still a regular board meeting that week as well, Thursday, November 21st. You have a legislative survey in your packets. About half of the board last year filled out the survey of which state legislators you know and how well you know them. That is tremendously helpful when we then go and have meetings, because we know which of you knows the legislators really well. Please, if you haven't, fill that out. It's a key to our success. Getting to the delegation here in the Capitol. And then just finally, I would say January 30th and 31st, per my note earlier this week, hold those dates for a possible trip to San Diego. San Diego Association of Governments, our peer agency, has invited us down. We're working to confirm that and firm that up. And it'd be a one-night stay over 2 days, pretty close by, and I think some important lessons to learn. So January 30th and 31st, Director Frost, I'm afraid you may have a county retreat that day. We did try to plan on the 5th days of the month, but apparently others beat us to it in some cases.
So we gave you a reason not to have to go to that boring county retreat.
Exactly. Come to San Diego.
And with that, please, if you can, we're having the lunch after, and even if you can stay for a little bit. With our Civic Lab teams, we'd love you to stay and participate as much as you possibly can.
All right. Thank you all very much, and we are adjourned.
Thank you.